So, welcome back to Third Age Reforged and to another battle replay, and this is on a map that was made by Tommy, which initially I was actually going to show on the old version of the game. However, he reran it on the new test patch, and so we will be showing this version instead. Not only is it of higher quality, but also it being on the test build means we can talk about some of the new things that some of the factions on the field today have going on, and we will actually get to see Dunland as well, which we've seen them only once before in these previews, so that'll be pretty good to see. Now, I'd like to say there's something of a theme here, but there really kind of isn't. I mean, you could, I suppose, view it as the more established civilization, I suppose, on the attack, and maybe some more tribal elements on the defence, with Dunland, the Rhovanion, the Easterlings, but Dol Amroth being right in the middle of things kind of makes that fall apart as well. But to be fair, the attackers do have something of a unified theme going on. Certainly Gondor, Lothlorien, the Shire and Cardolan are four factions that you would kind of expect to be fighting alongside one another. It's more of a strange coalition that's on the defence, but no matter. It being the new patch means that we can wash away some of those irregularities, I think, just by being able to see some new things. And we'll go through the attacking armies first and foremost before going through the defenders. I mean, this settlement in general is kind of one of those old style cityscape settlements, albeit it's a little bit more scattered. There's a lot more empty, well, I say empty, a lot more wide open spaces, which can be used to the advantage of both sides, and the further you retreat back, you can go into narrower defensive positions, which the defenders will probably need to do, but even so, it's going to be interesting to see how they grapple with all the space that they are being given to defend. Django here, playing as the Gondorians. The Gondorians, of course, the main things that they've had changed have been the numbers of their more basic units, not so much the Gondor archers. They're still very much the same sort of thing, very basic in terms of what they offer, but trading back and forth with the Rhovanion as it is on this side of the map, and the Rhovanion are a little bit more separated by these cliffs through the middle of the settlement from their allies than the others, so it is more likely to be a straight 1v1 over here, actually, at least initially. So the skirmishing back and forth between the two of them, I mean, the veterans of Osgiliath, the very high-end Gondor archers, should give Gondor a little bit of an edge over the Rhovanion, but of course when it comes to their more heavily armoured core of units, the defenders here are going to have answers for the Gondorians, even though they may not be enough to outright win fights like that. Gondor infantry with the armour upgrades as well. This is one of the things that has changed, of course. They've been made far more numerous, and considering the two levels of armour upgrades that Gondor can put onto these guys, and indeed armour upgrades still very central to what Gondor can do to help get a little bit more effectiveness out of many of their units, not only their rank and file but some of their stronger units as well, like the veterans of Osgiliath can go right up to gold armour, which they have done here. So pretty broad spectrum really of the kind of effectiveness you can expect from the Gondorians as a result. And they should do very well against the tribal units, maybe not so much against stuff like the Berserkers, who are going to be able to inflict a lot of armour-piercing damage onto them. But against a lot of the less impressive melee combatants that the tribals do have, Gondor infantry should be fairly ideal at dealing with them. Maybe a little bit more slow-paced against the Rhovanion units. Though this is where stuff like the Guards of Osgiliath can come into play. Obviously Gondor well known for their polearms, and the Guards of Osgiliath now will form a very important part of Gondor going forward. I think now that the Fountain Guard have been changed to be a little bit more of an aggressive style unit as opposed to this kind of phalanx unit, the Guards of Osgiliath will take on a little bit more importance, and of course the extra length of pikes is always going to be somewhat useful. Speaking of which, we do have the Fountain Guard back here now, obviously using their weapons in a more aggressive stance, not dissimilar to like the Nurad Storm Guard have gone through a similar change in the past. So too will the Fountain Guard now. It does give Gondor maybe some much needed options when it comes to dealing damage just a little bit more quickly. They tended to be a little bit slower in the previous patch, even when they were able to use units like this to their fullest. But it does mean that they have traded in another defensive tool. But the rest of their roster can make up for that. And the Nimlothian Honour Guard have gone through the same thing as well, and this is a little bit more interesting because they used to be, of course, a standard heavy spear unit, but now they're effectively a kind of a shock infantry, high-end bodyguard unit, fairly unique for what they are. Again, the Nurad Storm Guard probably represent the closest thing to them, but they are shielded and much more heavily armoured than that offering of a unit from Khand. So plenty of quality there, and then Pelagia Marines here at the back as well. Whenever you're going through a cityscape like this where there is a little bit more room, attacking javelins can be so useful for helping to whittle down the front lines that the defenders will be trying to set up. And Citadel Guard over here as well, another unit which has changed, of course, now they have been given the extra utility of having ranged attacks as well. Another javelin unit. They're obviously very expensive still, but having another feather in their cap is certainly not going to hurt them any. Now then, moving on to Y2K86, playing as Lothlorien. Galathrim archers here at the front, and heavy elven archers like this are of course going to be fantastic at dealing damage. They're also going to be very good individually in melee. Lothlorien, as far as their armour values go, they will be able to skirmish back and forth with defenders, though of course elven units do tend to be small enough to the point where that isn't ideal if you can help it, but the damage should mean that they should have the beating of Dol Amroth in that regard anyway, but it's a fairly expensive endeavour to go in like that. We've got some Lorien spearmen just in behind, so the basic grey-clad Lorien units. This kind of elven spear does tend to do fairly well in melee against equivalent units, though the more lightweight nature of them does mean that they suffer a little bit if they come under sustained arrow fire, and also they're not the most sturdy unit when it comes to taking continuous damage from multiple sources because of that lower armour score. But we'll see. I mean, this is the new patch after all, and the meta of the game will shift a little bit, so old preconceptions about this kind of unit will need to be let go of, but being on the attack like this was where units like this tended to be a little bit weaker, so we'll see if that is still the case. We have the ballista crew, and they of course have got long weaponry as well, so cavalry won't be having quite such an easy time at charging into them, though archers of course, just having a look at the armour score that they inevitably have, probably going to be very effective against them. But a ballista, and they should find some fairly good gaps. Some Galathrim spearmen, so again a heavier unit, this more of a defensive edge to them, but they're going to be able to withstand an awful lot of punishment. And considering the kind of force they're up against directly in the shape of Dol Amroth, when you consider Dol Amroth's best units tend to be heavy swordsmen, stuff like Galathrim spearmen will be able to withstand quite a beating from even units like that. Galathrim nobles over here, of course, previously the Watchers of the Golden Wood, very strong in melee, very good from afar as well with their specialty projectiles, and the mounted version as well is here as well, I believe, Galathrim riders. So they're going to have plenty of these, and it gives them a little bit more mobility, and given the space in behind the defenders, that is going to be useful. Kindred of Celeborn are over here. You can see that they have been changed pretty drastically. I mean, Lorien, it was always a little bit peculiar, the fact that Lorien had two bodyguard tier archers. You very often saw both of them come into play anyway, but now the Kindred of Celeborn are throwing axe units as well as being the dual wielders that they always were in close melee. So this gives Lorien a bit more close range punch than they used to have, and it gives them a little bit more of an option when things are starting to go south for them in direct melee. And also we have the Galathrim Axemen, who also have the same distinction now, so it changes Lothlorien fairly considerably. This is the main change which I think their faction has gone through, the fact that they have access to these throwing axes now, a very powerful class of unit as we've seen in the past, and it gives Lorien that extra damage dealing edge as well, which they always were damaging in melee, but now they've got that close range punch to be able to back it up and contest other throwing projectile factions as well. Now then, we have the Shire, played by Medek, so we've got the Shire Sheriffs, who, this is a little bit of a bug that they have going on. They've got a sort of weird phasing through the horses, but I don't think they've changed in any other way. I think this is more because the actual model for the horse is supposed to be a pony. But yeah, they're still very much that throwing projectile horse unit, which is meant to slowly whittle down enemy cavalry. They'll want to stick in close proximity to the Galathrim riders, I assume. Strength in numbers, after all. We have, well, more on them in just a moment, but we have the battling Brandybucks over here, so as always, I don't think the Shire really has changed all that much in terms of mechanics. We may see the odd new unit model, such as the one in behind there, but generally speaking, very annoying to fight, lots of hidden units, plenty of armour piercing as well. We have the skin changers here, who look like guys in bear costumes, just like toweringly tall. It's a bit peculiar. I think they're still fiddling around with this particular model. If they can get it looking right, then I actually do approve of this, but we'll see. I don't know how the skin changes are actually going to be in melee. I don't know whether they're going to be similar to something like the Ents or not. And then in behind we have the Shire Guard. So this is actually a new unit that they do have, a halberdier unit. Of course, they have the same sort of look as the old mercenary class units. And that's pretty neat. It does give them another direct frontline option. They didn't really have anything that was truly capable of holding a line indefinitely other than the Proudfoots, which are just in front of them. of course, with their pikes in melee, but primarily you want to be using them as crossbows if you can help it. But still, plenty of polearms, and of course there will be plenty of units that reveal themselves from hiding as well. And then last, but by no means least, we have the Principality of Cardolan. They've got a few new units. We've seen them recently as well in one of the preview battles for Fornost. Plenty of new models. Dunland captains here, a melee cavalry unit, which is certainly a big deal for Cardolan, actually, considering the fact that all of their cavalry units in the past have been lancers. They haven't really been able to go toe-to-toe on horseback with other factions before, but something like the Dunland captains here will allow them to do that. They look very resplendent as well in their new gear. We have got some Cardolan sharpshooters just in front. Again, I made quite clear in the last battle for Fornost that I really do approve of this new look for Cardolan. It makes them look... They're a lot sleeker now than they used to be. The old helmets and the look, they looked kind of bulbous. It was a bit peculiar, but now they look much meaner. Cardolan sharpshooters, of course, still very central to much of what Cardolan will be wanting to do. We have the Tharbad Toll Keepers, which this is going to be the old, well, the replacement for the Greenway spear units, I believe, and they look a little bit more ready for action, I would suggest, than they used to be. It does have a tendency, though, that many of the Cardolan entry-level infantry units don't tend to have the highest damage scores, and I believe that is still the case. They're pretty good at taking a beating, provided their morale doesn't collapse, but they are very reliant on their higher tier units and their crossbow support in order to be able to do their damage. Warns of Tir Gorthad, of course, they have the upgraded, the updated armour model as well, obviously the high tier pikes that they have. We have the Tharbad Warhammers, who unfortunately for them actually in the last preview, in much the same way as many of the defenders, found themselves really struggling to deal with the momentum that Angmar had built up, and now maybe the shoe is on the other foot and they can be the attackers themselves, albeit armour piercing like this may not be at its strongest on this side of the field because it is Dunland who they are directly facing off against. The Gatekeepers, still the same as they always were with their full plate armour, obviously very, very good all-around unit with their crossbow bolts and their halberds. More Greenway foot, well actually the first unit of Greenway footmen we've seen, so basic pikes for Cardolan. Then we also have the Hearthguard as well as a Trebuchet, which the Trebuchet crew is a unique unit as well, which is interesting. So, interesting to see how Cardolan get on with making their way through Dunland, and I'm going to be interested to see what Dunland have actually brought. We have seen them before, but we may get to see a few more units here today. Dunlanding Clansmen, of course, still the same unit they always were. I think this is actually a unit which still exists from vanilla as well. They are ever more thin on the ground, but of all things, the Dunlanding Clansmen are still here as the entry-level force for Dunland, of course. Plenty of anti-cavalry, but we'll see. Anti-cavalry is not going to be wasted because there are attacking cavalry units on the field, but mainly they're going to be needing to do damage. Unfortunately for Dunland, they do have access to armour piercing, plentiful armour piercing, which is going to be useful, especially against Cardolan. We have the Dunish Huskarls over here with their big bilateral axes, exactly the sort of thing which they're going to need to hew through the entry-level ranks of Cardolan, though they will struggle a little bit more so against the higher-end variants. Dunish Huntsmen, basic unit of archers this, not really the kind of faction which is going to be super set up for trading back and forth with heavy archers, though Cardolan haven't really brought any of those today. They've instead gone for more crossbows. Of course, Dunland themselves can also contest the crossbow game with the Ravenborn Wardens. This is, of course, effectively the replacement for the Spears of Orthanc as part of the kind of Dunland faction we always used to have. This is much more in keeping with what they're all about, so less armoured, but maybe a little bit more well-rounded, and certainly more in keeping with what Dunland are all about as a faction. Dunlanding Pikemen, a basic unit of pikes this, most certainly, kind of similar to the ones they're inevitably going to be facing off against in the form of Cardolan today. We have some Dunlanding Clansmen pikes, we've got more Dunish Huskarls. We have the Dunish Warband, which are a unit of slingers. We've seen slingers in the past. Not the highest base damage, but they certainly have the ability to do a lot of damage over time, not the sort of unit you can leave to their own devices. Otherwise you can very quickly find your army bleeding out as a whole. We've got no other units that are different in there, although back here we do have the mounted Ravenborn Wardens, so that's of course, again, much like the Riders of Orthanc previously. We now have them. We have the unlocalized placement text, a catapult on this occasion. I don't know what unit this actually is in melee, but it looks like a two-handed spear unit with not a lot of armour. Maybe more damaging than you would expect, but That's me purely going off the visual aspects of the unit. There's a lot of them, you're not going to be able to kill them all off quickly, but yeah, cavalry is also not going to have the easiest time of it. Maybe a few units that have been hidden as well. We move on to her Tumihai playing as Rhun. Rhun have shown up quite a lot actually in these preview replays, and that may have something to do with the fact that they're pretty well balanced as a faction, so they're pretty good for testing. Carmel's Immortals, a basic unit of dual-wielding infantry. Not the best individually, although, you know what, that's maybe being a bit unfair. They are actually pretty decent in melee for the tier of unit that they are, but the fact they don't have a shield is maybe a bit of a concern. The Easterlings, of course, as always, going to be able to bring a lot of armour piercing to the table, which, other than the Hobbits, that is going to be useful, even against Lothlorien. Plenty of Flagrim, Gamprim in behind here as well, forming up a very important phalanx for the Eastlings. We have the Flagrim, we have plenty of Scion Rim here at the top, the very deadly Dragon's Wrath crossbows also. The Eastlings, they can spend a lot of money on their mid-tier units, but it is important as well to intersperse that very high quality that they have as well, especially with regards to their support units. Dragon's Wrath crossbows in there. We have the Dragon's Wrath Warlords. Interesting to see how they get on against the kind of varied cavalry that the attackers have today. They'll be able to fairly easily deal with the sheriffs if they caught up to them, but I don't think they'd be able to beat the Galathrun Riders still. And the Dunland Captains, of course, being a melee cavalry unit, you'd expect them to have the beating of them there too. Carmel's Immortals, we also have the Dragon's Breath up here on this fortification, so they're going to be able to shoot into and maybe force the elves into an early commitment here. And that's pretty much that. Moving on to Dol Amroth, played by Portaleno, Belfalas Marines, and we also have the Halberdiers in here as well. Some basic archers, so nothing too out of the ordinary here. The Halberdiers forming up yet more important phalanx units, though it must be said. The pike advantage is probably going to be in favour of the attackers today, generally. Outside of the Rhovanion, they don't really have the defenders a really beefy unit of pikes. Mostly they're going to be reliant on halberdiers here in the middle, though against the elves and the Shire, maybe that's not the worst thing. We've got the Dol Amroth Men-at-Arms, Dol Amroth Spearmen, again basic units, but numerous, and numbers is something which the defenders in the past have very often neglected. But with superior numbers they should give the elves a bit of trouble, because the elves, regardless of what happens, are going to have to march into the Lion's Den. Talon Knights are here as well, of course. They've been changed a little bit as well. Previously dismounted Knights of the Silver Swan, they are now Macemen in melee, so it gives Dol Amroth a higher tier armour piercing option, which they have decided to take. And last but not least, finally we get round to Tommy, who is the map creator, playing as the Rhovanion. We've seen them a little bit recently as well. A lot of people do quite like them in the community, playing as them, because the mix between the Rudauer-esque tribal units and then perhaps the much more defensive, more Western Kingdoms of Men style higher tier units, that is a pretty good and potent mix. Rhovanion nobles here represent a really strong unit of shock cavalry, which Gondor do have the ability to deal with cavalry a lot, of course, because of all their spears and polearms, but cavalry really is all about how well you can play with them, and if they can get some good charges off into Gondor, that really does put them on the back foot. Tribal Berserkers are very important to the Rhovanion, because it's one of really the main unit for damage dealing in melee, and especially against a force like Gondor, they're going to be very, very useful indeed. Support has also been very important for the Rhovanion units that we have seen in action so far. Javelins and slingers in behind their fairly solid front lines have been one of the ways in which we've seen them be very effective recently. And the skirmishers and I think the slingers, yes indeed, both going to be present on the field today. We have the Rhovakin Nobles, again more of a defensive bodyguard unit, this sitting right in the middle of the line, but that is good considering the way the rest of the faction is built. Rhovakin Hoplons, the standard line unit that the Rhovanion are going to use, they are of course spears, so that's not going to be the best at dealing damage, but spears of course have got the advantages in terms of defense with how quickly they can attack. We have the Rhovakin Phalanx, a shielded unit of pikes. This of course, as I mentioned, probably going to be the one area where the defenders do have a slight edge in terms of pikes. I mean, I think the Rhovakin Phalanx, just based on the merit of their shields, are going to be a little bit more survivable all round the Guards of Osgiliath. More slingers, more spears as well, so regular spears. This is going to be the very entry level unit, similar to the Dunlendings that we've seen. Slingers, spears, more phalanx units and more hoplons as well, so pretty much as you would expect based on what we have seen of the Rhovanion before. maybe less berserkers than I was expecting, but maybe going for a little bit more of a well-organised approach rather than trying to win through outright damage dealing. But yes, I can't imagine there's going to be a huge cut here, considering how close some of the armies actually are, so without further ado, let's get this show on the road, shall we? So to be fair, not actually a huge grace period going on with this one, as the Danish huntsmen already opening up on the Cardolan forces that are moving around the side, and the Rangers already in full view. A few more of the Dunland units have revealed themselves as well, including some of the half-orc units that they still have in their roster. This is a rather open side of the map, like I've already said, in the composition phase to try and defend. Dunland may actually be the least suited of all the defenders today, so we'll see how they do when they're slightly out of their comfort zone, given that they are ultimately the lightest of the defending factions on the field today. Although with the tools such as this, there's a lot of punch on these mounted Ravenborn Wardens, though I wouldn't fancy their chances going into melee against something as heavy as the Dunedain captains, though the captains are not going to be able to catch up to them quite so easily. That was very nicely done actually by Hidden, cutting it a little close, but perfectly to make sure that the Dunlending clansmen would intercept the Dunedain captains without the ability for Cardolan to cancel that charge. Still fairly rough on the clansmen though, as much as Spear Militia really does find its way there. There's also a melee engagement already happening here. The Shire, in this kind of situation, I mean, I'll be interested to see what the skin changers can do immediately here against an established unit of line infantry like the Flag Rim. But generally speaking, the hobbits are not going to be quite so effective at going into these really narrow choke points. They're going to find it quite difficult with their own defensive frailties. And Rhun themselves, while they do lack a little bit in comparison to some of the heaviest factions in the game, especially when you consider the Flag Rim and the Scion Rim, they should be absolutely fine when it comes to sheer heft in a really narrow engagement such as this one. And I don't know, I think the Skin Changers are surely a monstrous infantry unit, so I think actually the Spear Malice will be coming into effect for the Scion Rim, as much as they are pretty bulky. I don't believe the Skin Changers are going to be too worried about that. The Dunedain captains still flitting around, Carmel's Immortals still over here, so Rhun can go to the aid of Dunland should the need arise. And still the Ravenborn Wardens, the Tharbad Toll Keepers move forward, and you would imagine, as much as they themselves are a fairly basic spear unit, all things considered, they should still have the beating of the Dunlending clansmen, certainly. Especially with how scattered the Dunlanders are currently. And of course the Gatekeepers are also moving into place. Dunish Warband throwing projectiles, artillery starting to rain down. I mean, Cardolan, surely still among the Western Kingdoms, are going to have some sort of morale issue, but being the great leveler there, ooh, Half-Orc Axguard also have their throwing projectiles too, so another example of the more tribal kingdoms of men relying on such skirmishes a little bit more, and with the damage they can do quickly, why not? Don't know what the Gatekeepers are going after. I mean, the mounted Ravenborn Wardens would probably be the thing that's in view over here. The rest of these units from Dunland are not particularly high tier. They've also got their own variants on the Ruffians that Cardolan are using. Yeah, and perhaps not surprisingly, they are going after the mounted Wardens. Over yonder, Gondor, I don't know if this is a particularly good matchup for Gondor, actually. It's only really against these tribal levy spears where a lot of their units that they have brought are going to be really, really effective. And even then you can see that there's already slingers offering their support in favour of the tribals that are holding the line. Gondor certainly have a more varied roster than the Rhovanion, unsurprisingly. But they don't have their Axemen of Lasarnak today for the Rhovanion units. Armour piercing and slightly shorter supply outside of their Fountain Guard, who are probably the most effective unit they have brought against these kind of units. Yeah, it's an interesting matchup, this. It's not fully polar opposites in the same way that Gondor and Harad maybe is, but it's heading in that direction with the tribal elements and then the heavily armoured backbone that the Rhovanion also enjoy. You can see here the tribal levy spears are unsurprisingly struggling against the fully upgraded Gondor infantry in melee terms. Pretty much all of the kills that would have been inflicted on this Gondor infantry would have come from the supporting slingers. And there are a few Dol Amroth units just in behind as we head over the mountains, which really do segregate the Rhovanion off a little bit. You can see there are ways up over here, but thus far Lothlorien not too eager to march into the lion's jaws, and I'm not surprised by that at all. Lothlorien can't sustain their assaults for as long as the other three factions on the field today can, but they may not have a choice in the long run. Cardolan and the Shire will need a little bit of peripheral support from the quality the Owls have. Dunland Captain's getting a bit of a charge onto the Carmel's Immortals, and that is damage that is effectively free. The Carmel's Immortal's not going to be great at withstanding cav charges. The nearby Dragon's Wrath Warlords will be hoping to ward off further examples of such. Some skin changes in and amongst the Narim. The skin changes, in general, these kind of monstrous units, especially the smaller ones, actually, the individual models seem extremely strong, as we have mentioned in the past. The recent Battle of Fornost, we saw how destructive the Angmarim trolls could be, and the skin changes perhaps offer that exact same thing for the hobbits here. The Shire Guard are now moving forward, trying to anchor in the gains that they have already made, although they of course are a rather obvious target for the banks of Narim that are firing in, and the Shire themselves may be also a little bit more susceptible to these fiery projectiles. That was attacking artillery, wasn't it? That is threading the needle for the trebuchet there. They stand just as much chance, I think, of getting friendly fire as they do of hitting the runic units there. Bouncing projectiles there, dangerously bouncing back towards their own settlement there. The Dragon's Breath. It is a weird bouncing projectile there. Anyone who remembers the Grand Bombards from Medieval 2. They are very different than Dragon's Breath from what I remember the Grand Bombards being, but the bouncing projectiles I certainly remember. And that's exactly the sort of thing which is going to be very capable of routing off these forces fairly fast. Meanwhile, what sort of gains have been made? So far, actually, Cardolan are not hitting Dunland from both sides. They're continuing to try and focus up front here. And the addition of the pikemen has stalled out Cardolan's advance a little bit, and they are wavering. Yes, Niehoff going to need to commit some more reinforcements to the front line here. Make sure everything is able to keep its shape. Thieves of Tharbad here got their projectiles in their hands. I suppose Cardolan, do they have the numbers really to be covering both sides? I would say probably they could have done. Greenway footmen and the like, but maybe a little bit of support from the hobbits here at ground level would have been the thing. Going this way instead. Instead, the Shire wanting to try and focus on Rhun, who are in a narrower part of the battlefield. I'm not sure I would have suggested such things, but the play has been made at this point. What's going on there? What on earth are those projectiles? Are they Nafatoon projectiles? Why are they so big? What a weird situation. Belfast Marines on the way across to try and give Rhun a little bit of a helping hand. Yeah, they are Nafatoon projectiles. Why are they massive? Jumbo-sized projectiles. Great irony of the hobbits being the ones to throw them. Bandbrass archers offering a little bit of support. I mean, the hobbits are well known for having a pretty varied and damaging archer corps. They are at a bit of a disadvantage terrain-wise, however, and none of them are particularly solid in terms of their defensive values. I guess you could say the Proudfoots are. They're continuing to take a real pounding at the hands of that cannon, however. Meanwhile, over here, Django struggling to make any gains against the Rhovanion as well, and as soon as the tribals started to look like they were flagging a little bit, some more serious spearmen were sent forward. The Rhovakin Hoplons, much more difficult for the Gondor infantry to do damage against them, and also the Dol Amroth spearmen, kind of the same, although the Rhovakin are of a higher tier, but still, both certainly are superior to the tribals that were here before. Some Lothlorien troops making an appearance as well. The Galathrim Axemen, I mean, they're getting straight into melee, so have they used their axes? Probably, based on the kind of damage the Rhovakin archers have already sustained. I mean, Lothlorien troops in melee with their damage will be enough to give something like the Hoplons pause. They may be impressive defensively, but they're not going to have the attacking capabilities with that spear malice to be able to whittle down mainline elven units. So numbers are going to be important here. Citadel Guard are also close to melee as well. As much as having the projectile is useful, there is a certain downside to both the Galathrim Axemen and the Citadel Guard having this projectile, and that's that if you want them to get into melee straight away, you're going to have to waste the ammunition, and you're going to have to do the secondary order for them to move into melee, and sometimes you can kind of miss that when there's a lot going on and you're microing. It's a little bit easier to lose micro. It is still worthwhile to have an extra facet to your unit, however, and especially with ranged attacks like that, but still, there are potential downsides to it. Tribal Levy Slingers still getting into decent positions in all fairness. And the Gondorians, as much as it is part of their identity really to be able to take a beating with their armour and their shield focus, it's not the sort of thing that they can handle indefinitely, I would have thought. Well, there's this other route that can be taken, and Django clearly intends to, with units already stacking up. The tribal units and Gondorians already have had a little bit of an engagement over here, but just one unit of infantry and the supporting slingers once again proving to be a real difference maker. Heading away over to the other side of the battlefield, Ruffians moving forward, still not committing to a melee engagement over here, but then again Ruffians and Gatekeepers, as soon as they're out of ammunition they could perhaps. Dunish Warband. Be interesting to see how much, well I guess we won't be able to see actually how much damage the Dunland skirmishers have got, because we're not viewing the battle from their perspective. The Beastmen of Dunland, almost like they're cosplaying as the skin changers on the opposition team. They're getting into melee, and clearly an aggressive kind of unit. I can't imagine defensively they're up to much, but trying to be the final nail in the coffin of this assault, there's certainly nothing wrong with that. They may get caught on the end of a few units of pikes now, but that extra damage might be enough to deal with most of the basic units that Cardolan have left over here, though they're fairly few in number. Tharbad Warhammers moving forward again. Like I said, Tharbad Warhammers probably at their least useful against Dunland, if anything, but their sheer quality will still be enough to give the wild man pause. Dunish Warband as well. This raised bit of terrain can only be accessed from behind the current Dunland front line, so they're in a very good position to be throwing their projectiles into the back of the line, which is another thing perhaps which Cardolan have overlooked so far in this engagement, and Dunland have done quite well, considering I thought they were the least suited to this kind of warfare. Though in all fairness, I think you could substitute Dunland with any faction, and if the overall tactics from both sides remain the same, the outcome would probably be the same as well. Though admittedly Dunland's damage dealing credentials have probably assisted them in mulching their way through the Cardolan forces a little bit more quickly than they otherwise would. Cardolan starting to try and commit some units elsewhere. There's a lot of dead runic cataphracts. What on earth has transpired over here? Cardolan sharpshooters nearby. Sheriffs may be out of ammunition at this point. Certainly not the same level of fear being inflicted by them as was by the Dunedain captains earlier, as the Carmel's Immortals continue to stand in the way and take cavalry charges bravely. It is quite telling though that Cardolan are starting to send more and more units over here. There's a lot of damage, however. Once again, they are having to bank their shots slightly. Was it runic crossbows as well, possibly? Dragons, yeah, Eastron crossbows are way up here, so kind of 6 of one, half a dozen of the other. But the attackers need to get some sort of win here. I think the defenders will be quite content with the fact that they're managing to shut down Cardolan's dangerous crossbows and then simply rely on the advantages that they've already gained over here. The Shire Guard on their last legs. Cardolan General. It's a big loss. They need those morale boosts. I mean, they are in behind enemy lines though, such as they are. I think they're probably thinking about a retreat, or maybe not actually. They can outright beat Cardolan over there. Again, continuing to feast upon these Carmel's Immortals, but they are ultimately one of the least important defending units today. It's worth bearing in mind. Dunish Huskarls, you don't want to stay in melee with them for too long. Heavy axe units can do pretty well against heavy cavalry like this in melee. The charge is often pretty harsh on them, but as soon as the regular engagement starts, that's where their armour piercing really does kick into effect. And here we can see the Tharbad Warhammers getting overrun by the Beastmen of Dunland. I don't think any amount of support is going to be enough to turn their fate around. Not now. Elsewhere, Danish warband getting into melee. Thieves of Tharbad just about alive as well, though certainly not enough of them to make any sort of difference moving forwards. This is going to be a big win for the defenders. Dunland are going to be able to move to Rhun's aid and try and help deal with the Shire, and we could start to see a macro-style domino effect happen across the battlefield here if the defenders play their cards right. I mean, the elves are still pretty much completely healthy, but on the same, in the same vein, so are Amroth, so it's a risky thing when the attackers are relying on something like that. Lothlorien Honour Guard and Fountain Guard now moving forward, so this is a big play from Gondor because they can claim some real momentum for their team if they're able to start forcing the Rhovanion onto the back foot. With a unit like this moving forward, also another unit of Gondor infantry and unsupported tribal units like this. We've already mentioned this is where the basic rank and file Gondorians will be extremely effective. And more isolated engagements like that will be a good thing for Gondor, and indeed I think you can see Gondor are starting to really hammer home a bit of a quality advantage on the front line now against the Rhovanion. They are forcing them back. Galathran Axemen moving forward, Talon Knights standing in the way. Those maces certainly won't go completely to waste against the Galathran, but numbers here may very well prove to be a bit of an issue already. They do have more reinforcements, the Rhovanion, and the Amroth Untitled Champions, very dangerous of course, so setting up a new defensive line, so not a huge amount of territory gained for Gondor, but certainly with themselves and a little bit of support from Lothlorien, the attackers finally have something to cheer about in this battle. Victory seems certain for the Talon Knights for the moment, though again, like I said, as soon as the reinforcements come forward, that's more questionable. What are the ballista firing at? Possibly the Hoplon line over there? No, now they're moving. I was going to say, it was a little bit of a peculiar choice. So, I mean, most of Lothlorien are going to be, or the vast bulk of them are going to be moving over to help Gondor, which means Amroth, they can't afford to take their eye completely off the ball over here, but more, I think, is ultimately going to be needed to give the Rhovanion a bit of a hand. If they can do that, the defenders, I don't think they'll have too much to worry about, given the way that the winds of battle blow over here. The elves starting to move forward to try and give a bit of a hand, although maybe from an attacking perspective that hand comes a little bit too late. Battling Brandybucks on the front line, that are rather piercing, trying to make its way through that runic armour. I'm just impressed with the Shire Guard still standing and fighting in spite of fighting a losing battle for quite a while at this point. More Shire Guard, the Proudfoots, crossbows as ever, projectile units difficult to keep track of in detail, though we can certainly see what fate has befallen the Cardolan sharpshooters. Some Dunedain Rangers revealing themselves also. More Dunedain Rangers. Do Dunland have the manpower left to them to chase down and finish off these units in their entirety? The Shire's Dunedain Rangers are on the way over here. Ironically enough, actually, the Dunedain Rangers should be fairly decent in melee against a lot of the lighter Dunland troops that you can see, and that's maybe why they're making decent progress towards the waiting half-orc Axe Guard, who are waiting still with projectiles in hand. Danish Huntsman, a dual wielder in melee. That in itself is a fairly interesting thing. And Portaleno sending over some Amroth units as well, playing mostly support as a result of how Lothlorien has chosen to approach this battle. And localised placement text. Waiting. Menacingly. Really interested to see what the Kindred of Celeborn are up to in melee, and actually looking like a full retreat now from the Rhovanion and Amroth. Where exactly they retreat to is going to be important. You're going to have to leave some units behind as a rear guard. These Hoplons would undoubtedly just rout anyway. Already shaken as well. The upper echelon of Rhovanion society not completely immune to that. Celeborn throwing these projectiles. I really like the idea actually of Lothlorien having these throwing axe units now available to them. It gives their ranged potential a whole different dimension. They always were obviously a fantastic archer faction, certainly in terms of damage, but now a little bit more close range punch as well makes them a little bit more well rounded in that regard. That only adds to their damage dealing focuses as well. Forward come the guards of Osgiliath, and that enough to rout the Rhovikin Hoplons. The Rhovirim nobles probably not going to be able to get some cheeky charges off onto the advancing units with the guards of Osgiliath at the front, but maybe archers can instead be the answer there. This little horseshoe-shaped road linking Dol Amroth and the Rhovanion, so far not really threatened, and with how much Lothlorien have siphoned off elsewhere, I don't think Dol Amroth should be too worried about that area. Just having a couple of units of fairly numerous infantry will probably be enough. The battling Brandybuck's actually making some decent progress there. The depleted runic forces not able to hold them at bay, and now the Nar Rim and the Eastron crossbows that are up here are now threatened. There's not a huge amount of numbers to be able to take advantage of this gap which is now here, and a point-blank volley from the Brandybucks. I mean, the Eastron crossbows are obviously awful in melee. However, victory seems certain. Trying to finish them off. I mean, the Eastron crossbows have certainly already done a decent amount of damage, especially to those Cardolan sharpshooters on the low ground, but kills are kills ultimately. As we've already mentioned, the attackers need to start finding victories where they can. If the victories continue to roll in for the defenders, this battle was only ending one way. That may be different now. Gamprim holding this mini horde at bay. Further across, Dol Amroth now moving over to try and assist against Cardolan, who with a little bit of help from the Shire, they have actually managed to gain a bit of traction against what remained of Dunland over here. If this had happened a little bit earlier, Dunland may very well have been struggling a little bit earlier as well. As of now, volleys coming in, Dunedain Rangers. Victory is almost a certainty for them, managing to get in behind enemy lines. Going after the Ravenborn Wardens, who may not be as armoured as they once were in the last patch, but in sheer melee terms they surely still have the edge, although I say that. The general was a little bit isolated and ended up getting shanked, so Dunland's general joins Cardolan's general in the grave. Hearthguard of Amon Sul forming up really the only unit that's still on this front line. The Beastmen of Dunland still alive, though more depleted than they were. Their damage will certainly help them against the highly defensive nature of the Hearthguard, but is that going to be enough? Bit of support from the Athalond units. The Dol Amroth Halberdiers facing off against an equivalent unit really in the Shire Guard. It's looking more and more actually like the attackers are slowly gaining more of a foothold. Will it be enough long term? Forward come the pikes, Proudfoot protectors. Catwalk Axguard doing their thing, artillery. I don't think the artillery's got quite the angle that the Dragon's Breath enjoys usually, but more routing would certainly be the thing to stifle all of the gains that the attackers have thus far made over here. Beastmen of Dunland still alive, they're just sort of standing there like lemons. Defeat seems certain, only a military genius could win this battle. The situation is peculiar. The Hobbit General falls. Are we starting to see? Yes we are. This position is now being pressurised. I think Lothlorien, seeing the fact that they were starting to make some gains over on the far side of the field, just trying to put some pressure on over here as well to make sure that Dol Amroth can't do any more moving around, although with stuff like that Haven Guard of Athalond moving in, I mean Sindar Blade Masters under normal circumstances would be so effective, but numbers wise and with the close proximity of those defending archers, Lorien may struggle to make the gains they want here, but it's better than just allowing Dol Amroth to shuffle around as they will, I think. really strong crossbows, having to stop the Lorien spearmen from trying to claim the manor house on the hill in the middle of this defence. They will, of course, be unsuccessful in that, but they will at least delay Lothlorien. Down here, the archers can only support one side of the engagement, and because it's not this one, the regular rank-and-file Dol Amroth troops will struggle a little bit against the quality that the Galathrun can bring to bear. Over here, meanwhile, Gondor continue to hound the Rhovanion unrelentingly. They need to find, I think, a singular defensive point at this point, the Rhovanion and whatever Dol Amroth troops may still be over here, and defend it with everything they have, because trying to go for this bits and pieces approach is not really serving them too well, and the Gondorians, because they're keeping up the pressure, are able to take advantage of all the weaknesses that that kind of tactic often has. Rhovikin nobles on the front line, along with the phalanx, enough to keep the Citadel Guard at bay for now, but Guards Roskilliath coming forward to try and equalise the pike engagement. Gondor infantry. Down as well. Tribal berserkers getting into melee. I mean, this is the sort of thing which may very well give the Gondorians pause, though this engagement does look a little bit chaotic for my tastes. Defenders often need to be a little bit more organised and regimented than this. Archers, skirmishers as well, so projectile support is one of the things perhaps that the Rhovanion can lean on a little bit more to get them back into true contention here. Gondor, though, still with plenty of reinforcements, as have the elves, although gaps being found here by some Dol Amroth units. A few Rhovanion units in tow as well. They need to be a little bit careful here, the attackers. They've sent a lot up to try and deal with that hillside defence, but they're going to have to reposition themselves now. I mean, Untitled Champions are the sort of thing which would give most Gondor units pause. They may lack the armour piercing, but I think the Galathrun Riders were on hand to really cut down on the numbers in that heavy sword unit pretty quickly. Dol Amroth Spearmen going to interrupt the Pelagia Marines, Tribal Berserkers, so a bit of a counter-attack here. Maybe didn't start in the best way with that cavalry charge into the Untitled Champions, but there's still plenty more where that came from, especially with pretty dangerous melee combatants like this at their heart. Oh, but again, though, the attackers doing exactly the right thing here. What are they called now? They're not the Watchers of the Golden Wood anymore, they are something else. What are they called? You've got the Galathrun Riders. Galathrun Nobles, was it? Anyway, the Silverthorn projectiles. Trying to go after the Berserkers. Trying to take advantage of their defensive discrepancies. There goes the Lothlorien general. He was part of the ballista crew. I mean, I suppose it puts added pressure on you to defend the ballista crew, but that only works if you bear it in mind throughout the entire battle, and Dol Amroth able to assassinate the Elven general. Unlike the Cardolan and Dunland forces, though, it's probably worth mentioning that the elves are a little bit harder to rout, so the loss of the general is likely not going to be the be-all and end-all of that. Meanwhile, the engagement over on the other side of the battlefield looks to be winding up at this point, and it is going to end in a very slight victory for Cardolan. The Hearthguard of Amon Sul able to force the Dunland clansmen back. I mean, a part of it is an organised retreat. Dol Amroth probably would have had enough there to help them win that. But Rhun also no longer heading to the front line with more units. I think pretty much the entirety of the Shire was defeated, but the added little pressure that Lorien was starting to put on the middle were too much for their liking. Dol Amroth still holding on the front as well, but there we have it. Not really much left from Dunland. Rhun a little bit more, but from an attacking perspective, Gondor and Lothlorien are going to be really the only ones left. Cardolan and the Shire very, very depleted. I mean, the Hearthguard are not a nothing unit by any means, so they may still play their part, but I think in particular with how conservative Lothlorien were early on, that elven quality is what they're going to have to lean on to try and achieve overall victory, I think. Amroth spears, making their way up into the more defensible areas of the battlefield. Where exactly they choose to go will be kind of interesting. Technically the highest point of the battlefield is here, so I think the most obvious point for a final stand might be right there in the middle around that small keep. You don't really want to go for the labyrinth at the back. You don't get any sort of terrain advantage there. Yeah, Gondor continuing to just sort of bludgeon their way through the Rhovanion. And thus far, of all the attackers, you would say Gondor have been the most successful just because of their... Well, early on they were at the mercy of quite a lot of the skirmishers that the Rhovanion had laid on for them. But as soon as they committed forward those high quality units and really took the edge in that melee engagement, they'd made it very difficult for the Rhovanion to reset themselves. And the Kingdom of Men showcasing what they're all about, most certainly. And surely this is going to be the end as well. I mean, Amroth Halberdiers, that was a bit bold, but it was enough to rout them in the end, the Galadhrim nobles and riders. You don't want the riders to end up simply decorating the end of a Amroth halberd. Just in behind Pelargia Marines, Athelian Rangers as well, so you can see they have the slightly bulkier unit model now as well. Another example of Gondor's love of armour coming into effect. That might be the armour upgrade on the Athelian Rangers in all fairness. Well, Amroth front lines. What remains of the resistance being put up over here, surrounded by Lothlorien as they made their way forwards. And unsurprisingly, the Amroth archers end up routing. Territory claimed, but now, what more is there? Amroth moving backwards, so perhaps the final stand is going to take place here at the back of the settlement. Another good position to do so is a gate, which cannot be traversed, but still, this is probably the best position for a final stand. I mean, the only thing is it will completely exclude the Rhovanion from joining it. If it were over in the middle of the map there, the Rhovanion could have reached it, but I mean, in all fairness, I don't think the Rhovanion really has enough left to be truly concerned about that anyway. So yeah, the Rhovanion gone, Dunland largely gone. It's going to have to be a runic and Amrothian affair to try and stop a largely Gondor and Lothlorien assault. The Rhovanion general finally falls, one of the last, in all fairness, of his army to bite it. Gondor now. Lothlorien Honor Guard still pretty healthy, honestly. They were part of the initial claiming of the momentum, and they are still very much here. The Fountain Guard are a little bit more thin on the ground, having a look at what's going on throughout these armies. But now, what have we here? Galadhrim Riders trying to hunt down a few units. The Rhovanion Nobles are still there. I mean, unfortunately, they're trying to do what they can to quickly hunt down these units before they retreat completely, but in so doing they've lost. That was a large amount of Kindred of Celeborn. That not the kind of unit that is easily replaced. Again, just about missing the vast bulk of that unit there. The Galadhrim Riders charging in. They can continue to nibble away at units like the Amroth Men-at-Arms, but close proximity of something like the Haven Guard, it's a high quality unit indeed. Armour piercing from Rhun will be useful against what Gondor have left. Talon Knights, much the same thing, 2 units of Talon Knights in various states of disrepair, admittedly. Rhovanion Nobles. So yeah, it's mostly Amroth in all fairness. Stuff like the Dragon's Wrath crossbows, and a little bit of armour piercing support from Rhun, and Tumenhai, but mostly he's going to be up to Portaleno to try and see his team to victory here. Galathrim Riders routing. I mean, going in after the artillery is understandable, but with how depleted the Galathrim were, and also you can see the fact that this artillery crew wielded spears, it was always going to be a risk, and it was a risk that did not play off for the elves. And I guess at this point it's worth going up to ×2 speed, possibly even ×6 actually, based on how far away some of the opposing forces are. And for the most part here it's going to be a case of poking one another back and forth with arrow fire. Just taking stock of what the defenders still have left. As a matter of fact, let's go into 1 speed for a moment and just take stock of what the attackers have as well. So Galathrim archers, who appear to still have ammunition. There's not a huge amount of them, but it rather depends on... if those Dragon's Wrath crossbows still have ammunition, this is going to be rough for the attackers, regardless of what they do, really. But they can try and shoot them down first a little bit. I mean, this Lothlorien force is not hugely substantial. There's a few heavier units. There's Galathrim archers that are out of ammo. There's some spears there, some standard Lorien units. Galathrim nobles, which are very strong in melee. In terms of pure melee stats, they're probably the strongest units left on the field. Defensively, that probably goes to the Nimlothian Honour Guard, but overall, I think in terms of overall usefulness, I think the Galathrim nobles probably take it here. Gondor moving across. I mean, Gondor, as much as they have been very impressive in this battle so far, they have still had to take a fair amount of losses in order to achieve this. Gondor archers making their way around. Gondor infantry as well. Yeah, a couple more units of Gondor infantry, so Gondor still have a fair amount left to them. How ironic that we end up with Gondor and Dol Amroth being on the two sides of things. The most, the healthiest forces left on the field. So now we'll go up to ×6 speed. I mean, you never truly know when battles like this are going to reignite, so I don't think we'll bother with a cut on this occasion. 83 Galathrim nobles. I mean, in terms of sheer quality, with that Gondorian heft that they still have available to them, I think this is going to be the key unit. I think these Dragon's Wrath crossbows that Tumenhai has available to him, how much ammunition they have is going to be key. But they're such a devastating kind of unit that, and also not half bad in melee either, fully able to throw down with many of the best. Dragon's Breath may still have a few hits left in it as well. Still quite a long way to go in this battle, in all fairness. Oof. Direct artillery hits on the Galathrim archers, most unfortunate. Are we going to see the melee engagement commence once more? It looked like we were going to for a brief moment there. But alas, no. And there's nowhere left for them to retreat after this, the defenders. They have played their card. I mean, Ravenborn Warden's still very much alive as well, albeit, unlike the Dragon's Wrath crossbows, their newfound lack of armour does make them more susceptible to this sort of thing. So perhaps it is wise to go after them instead of the Dragon's Wrath. Gondor archers in place. So they are going to attack from both directions here. That is the wise thing to do. Crossbows can only target down one front line at a time, after all. Galathrim archers in place. Are they going to start to shoot? Not yet. I mean, they're fully in view of the Dragon's Wrath crossbows, but perhaps, just like we said, the Ravenborn are actually their true target. They're more likely to score kills on them, after all. Over here. Slowly ambling their way forwards. And still, we wait. Those Lothlorien spearmen are edging their way closer to the front line. Oh, here we go. The final phase of the battle commences. I mean, Dunland clansmen, These are two very depleted units, neither of which are going to be the be-all and end-all for either side. But the engagement begins. Belfast Marines, I mean, they'll be able to overwhelm these Lorien spears pretty quickly without additional reinforcements. The attackers can't afford to waste any units, really, even a depleted unit of light spears like this. They're going to be fairly vital. Then comes the second unit of spears as well. So we'll turn this engagement around, and all of a sudden it's the Dunlanders that look like they're going to fall by the wayside. Through. Waiting to move forward. I mean, Gondor have come forward as well. Veterans of Osgiliath locked morale, gold level armour upgrades, but numbers not in their favour, and the Flag Rim, as far as an infantry unit goes, are very well suited to fighting the Gondorians, and standard Gondor infantry is not really going to be at its best here either. So I don't know how Gondor are truly going to move forward from this one. But we shall see. Do still have the support of those Athelian Rangers. They are going after the Dragon's Wrath crossbows, I think. The Dragon's Breath crew as well is another very strong melee combatant. This Gondor infantry is not going to last very long, and I question the wisdom of Django sending these guys in if he wasn't prepared to fully commit yet. Rotting meat. Rotting meat is probably not going to be all that useful against the elves, in all fairness. Galathan Riders, we have seen them rout once already, so maybe it'll be enough to send them over the edge, combined with the charge from the Belfast Marines here. Direct hit there from the Rotting Meat, and that's one of the very few occasions we've seen the Rotting Meat's direct hits score kills. More than one kill even as well. Friendly fire, admittedly. So it's a real rarity, and when it does happen, it just happens to be friendly fire. Most unfortunate. I would have thought the Belfast Marines would be a little bit more susceptible to routing as well on the front line here, but the engagements thus far, they haven't truly begun as of yet, and as I've said, there is still a fair amount in this battle left in terms of time. The Athelian Rangers still trying to go about their business. I mean, I don't know necessarily. I mean, Rangers, high base damage, you can see that a few of these Dragon's Wrath crossbows are falling, but not enough of them to prevent any sort of really heavy damage that is to come, surely. It. Tribal Levy Slingers. Well, very little remains of the Rhovanion will be very eager to claim some revenge on the Gondorians as they move through here, and Eastron crossbows as well. Another force of crossbowmen that I don't necessarily think there's too much that the attackers are going to be able to do about this situation. They don't have their own artillery, their own skirmishers. Probably used up vast quantities of their own ammunition. Brute force is probably the best way to go about things, and it seems like they're intent on sending their units forward in drips and drabs. I still if they do that, I think that slowly but surely the crossbows are just going to knock down each force as it comes forward. Whereas if you move forward in one great big lump, the front lines for the defenders may start to bow and break, but I fear we shall not be seeing that today. Instead it's going to have to be attrition. Although in fairness, ammunition exhausted, Rhun were using quite a lot of their ammunition earlier on, and the Dragon's Wrath crossbows now will have to be purely a melee force. Not that they lack quality in that regard anyway, but yeah, Guards of Osgiliath move forward, and it was and has been the Slingers doing most of the damage to them in melee, or from afar, and then the added armour-piercing bite of the Flag Rim in melee certainly not helping the Gondorian cause here. Moving forwards as well with Gondor archers, Gondor infantry, so reinforcements are still there, and we did mention how Gondor were looking fairly healthy still moving into these final phases, but I don't think that's going to be enough to make them victorious overall. Dol Amroth. Strong crossbows still with ammunition as well. I mean, ammunition supplies dwindling is the attacker's best bet here. Pelagian Marines taking hits from the slingers as well, not wanting to allow the Gondorians to get their own support into play. Wanting to keep those Flagrim as healthy as possible. Pelagian Marines already shaken as well. Out of ammunition, Gondor archers being sent forwards. Dragon's Wrath crossbows being added to the front line over here, though must be said over here the attacks are having more luck with the sheer quality that the elves are bringing to the table. Kindred of Celeborn are in there, plenty of Galathrim units, crossbow bolts are still raining down, and it will take the elves a little bit of time to get through these Dragon's Wrath units, but they will. So that time is going to need to be well spent by those defending projectiles, otherwise the elves could end up surrounding the defenders. I mean, surely with Talon Knights still alive, 2 units of Talon Knights, there's still the Haven Guard, the quality for Dol Amroth is still there, the artillery still has a bit of ammunition as well, albeit I think it's just rotting meat. So that may be more of a hindrance than a help. Still a bit of ammunition from these Ravenborn as well. Victory is a distinct possibility, is it? As the Dragon's Wrath crossmen attempt to move back into defensive shape. I mean, a nice victory that for the attackers. The elves claiming momentum, forcing the defenders back a little bit. The Flagrim were enjoying that engagement as well, but they're going to have to rejoin the rest of their line, otherwise they simply would have been surrounded, and as a result the Pelagian Marines have got a much better shot at them now as well. One Dol Amroth man-at-arms and one Flagrim as well. Finished off by the Gondorians. 74 Nimlothians, that's a significant force. Veterans of Osgiliath, of course, won't be going anywhere. That locked morale could prove to be a very useful trait to have in a situation such as this. Tribal Levy Slingers, still with ammunition. Slingers, ammo count, something else which the defenders will surely be quite glad of in a situation like this. Still the Galathrim Riders charging in, scoring a few more kills on the line infantry as it braces for the next phase of the assault. Less of a threat than the armour-piercing Flagrim, of course, though the Dol Amroth men-at-arms are still a perfectly dependable unit of swordsmen in a situation such as this. Big shields as well, though. Don't know necessarily how many arrows the attackers have left in them. I think most of them will surely have already been utilised. Cycle charging with 5 riders. I mean, everything's going to add up here. Lothlorien Honour Guard were thinking about moving forward there onto the direct part of the front line. They're going to try and force their way through, I think. And of course they will have the easy beating of Dol Amroth man-at-arms. Forward comes some elves as well. Of course this kind of unit is exactly the sort of thing which is going to be enough to draw attention. Kindred of Celeborn taking hits, not just rotting meat. Good use of varying ammo types there. I did see the Talon Knights enter the fray too. So that armour piercing clearly trying to counteract the effect that the Lothlorien Honour Guard are going to have on this front line inevitably. This is very close actually. It's going to be on a knife edge. Ravenborn Wardens moving out of harm's way. They were trying to shoot once again, but they were getting hit by the Pelagian Marines. Instead, the Slingers are going to take up their position once more. This front line, I'm not sure about it. The man-at-arms line is looking a little bit thin in certain places. Haven Guard of Athalond. Eastrons, Talon Knights. The second unit of them. Dragon's Breath firing as well. I mean, point-blank artillery hits that cause chain routes could be... They could really be the be-all and end-all at this later stage of the battle. There's still over 10k frames left, in all fairness. A sign of the level of quality that both sides are still working with and how long it will take to grind one another down. Vets of Osgiliath still to be committed. I mean, there's not much else though, is there? There's a few rank and file Gondorians, but not much beyond that. There's a few extra elves. There's still the Hearthguard. Cardolan's still alive. 25 Hearthguard of Amon Sul. That could be enough to make the difference. Oof. Bit of friendly fire in all fairness there as well. They managed to rout off some of the more depleted and less important Gondorian units. Guards of Osgiliath rout as well though. 20, 24, 25 of them when they routed, and again at this late stage pikes of any description can really make a difference, so in the end maybe that was worthwhile. The Flagrim now will be returning to the front line, a little bit of that armour-piercing bite reintroduced, but again the elves, those Kindred of Caliborn and the Galathrim nobles, they always were seen as a duo really, even with the Kindred of Caliborn no longer being an archer unit. It will not be surprising for Lothlorien pretty much every time we see them to have both of them in tandem, and when they're together like this, that is a huge quality spike that's on the front line, and as good as the Talon Knights are, it's not going to be enough. Largian Marines being thrown in. Extra melee expertise. I mean, the Lothlorien Honor Guard are still pretty healthy as well, and they're going to try and run through now, so quality-wise, the attackers are looking pretty well set now. And yeah, the Flagrim, who have been a little bit indecisive actually about moving into engagements and moving back when the front line was fully committed, finally having their hand forced by the Lothlorien Honor Guard. There's no way that they can just hang around behind the lines now, because the line as it is no longer going to exist. Ooh, point blank artillery hits. That's a little bit unfortunate actually for the defenders, because that was pretty much going to be the last hit that the Dunlanders were going to be able to inflict, and it wasn't particularly telling. Ravenborn Warden is going to try and do what they can to get out of this engagement so they can then start to shoot their crossbows again, but they're just going to run into Guards of Osgiliath here, and there's a little bit of panic setting in for the defenders. Slingers are still in a pretty good place though. The Slingers have probably been the best Rhovanion unit on the field. Earlier on in the opening stages, when they were actually doing quite well against Gondor, they were the key, and even here in the late game they're contributing in a not insubstantial way. The Haven Guard being this sort of isolated and in behind enemy lines is probably not a great thing. As good as they are, they may struggle against the numbers of the elves, although Slingers hitting them. Dol Amroth bodyguard quality in melee. Maybe the elves won't have it all their own way. Dragon's Breath crew being in effect a bodyguard tier unit in and of themselves may prove to be pretty important here as well, because it means that they're going to be extremely useful in melee. Strong crossbows are still firing. 84 crossbows, of course, as soon as they run out of ammunition they're not going to be up to much in melee, so as soon as, well, they need to make best use of all of these projectiles if possible. Hearthguard of Amon Sul already taking damage, the Elven Ballista crew, so it's really just a case of everyone giving all they've got here, all that they have remaining in the closing stages, and seeing if that's enough. Testing how well the battle went for them previously. All of these slingers as well. I mean, as much as Gondor had the initial victory, maybe the Rhovanion will yet have the last laugh with all of these units. Looks like they just ran out of ammunition. What's going on here? The unlocalized placement text. They're trying to remount the catapult, I think. I mean, in all fairness, they managed to reclaim a bit of territory with the Dragon's Wrath crossbows. One artillery shot into the Lothlorien Honour Guard and the Gondor infantry over there. One artillery volley. And that would probably be enough to secure victory for the defenders, so I'm not surprised Dunland are so insistent on trying to make that work. In all fairness, the Haven Guard have really done a huge amount of heavy lifting over here. I don't think this engagement would have gone this way had it not been for the peripheral support from those tribal slingers. But between them and the Talon Knights, they've done really very well against the cream of the elven crop, if you will. Gondor having to turn around as well. I mean, the Lothlorien Honour Guard are very strong, but it's looking more and more like the defenders may just edge this one out. It was looking early on, especially given Cardolan's fate against the initial Dunland force, that I wouldn't have been surprised if you told me then that the defenders were going to win, but the middle section of the battlefield went a little bit more favourably for the attackers, but maybe not quite enough to the point where they could claim victory here, perhaps. Wild men of Dunland. Still Ravenborn Wardens, and still the Galathrun Riders. I mean, in all fairness to the Galathrun Riders, they've routed once in this battlefield already. They've been used as a bludgeon far more so than as a horse archer, and they're still here, and they've been used pretty well by Y2K, I would say, given the circumstance. But there's only so much a unit like that is ultimately going to be able to accomplish. There goes the Runic General. But as soon as one of their friendly generals dies, the announcer announces his confidence of the defenders' chances. I mean, I agree, but still, the irony. That must be Cardolan, I assume, so that must be the last of the Hearthguard that just fell in melee. Then yeah, it's going to be the defenders, isn't it? The Nimlothians are really the only ones left on this front line over here, and they are surrounded. It will take its toll on what's left of Rhun and Dunland over here to finally finish them off. And then what remains over here, yeah, the Haven Guard. I mean, I guess it does go to show the difference between a dedicated heavy swordsman and a hybrid unit, which is what the Galathrun nobles ultimately are. Split focuses, whereas Dol Amroth dedicated to the sword and the sword alone. But the level of quality that we're talking about is still going to be a fair amount of time before all of these units fall, and there's also the small matter of the Galathrun Riders still buzzing around like an annoying mosquito, taking continued bites out of it, maybe trying to finish off the Rhovanion. Those slingers very important in the late game. I think it's hard to understate how important those slingers were to the defenders, and of course these E-strong crossbows from Hertumihai still with a bit of ammunition left. Crossbows are such an effective tool should you have access to them. We never really got to see, I mean, we saw Cardolan use their gatekeepers on the mounted Ravenborn, but the sharpshooters were bullied a little bit on the low ground maybe. If they could have used their crossbows in a slightly more favourable position, all would have been different. There's still a long way in this battle to go. I think we will go up to ×2 speed actually, just to hasten things along. I mean, if the Nimlothian Honour Guard can fight their way out of this position, it would be remarkable. But Haven Guard, Dragon's Breath, crew, various numbers, they are in a pretty good final stand position though. Sort of back to back, as it were. The elves are now gone, so I think fittingly the Gondorians are the last attackers left standing. I do think overall they probably deserve the most flowers of all the attackers today. Given they did manage to turn back the Rhovanion. You could argue the Rhovanion though did have the last laugh with those slingers here in the final stand. But a close one this. Always nice to see stuff, new stuff as well. Lothians really are they going to win? Surely not. Haven Guard, there's 21 of them. There's 11 more Lothians than Haven Guard, but then when you factor in Dragon's Breath and other miscellaneous units around them, surely they don't have the gumption left. And there is always a tipping point where when the unit goes below a certain strength, they really do start to collapse. I'd be extremely surprised if that did not occur here for the Gondorians. I mean, it'll show the Lothian Honour Guard's defensive credentials, if nothing else. The Haven Guard, after being so impressive against the Elves, surely they're not going to throw it all away now. I mean, to be fair, only one more of them has died as well, so I do think they will still be fine, but yeah, defeat is almost a certainty. The Dunland artillery crew trying to get in and amongst things as well. Yeah, they're trying to get out of there. I think that was why. I think too much of them were taking the attention of the Lothians, and that's why the Gondorians seemed to be doing so well. But not a huge amount left. I mean, if you have a look, it's 1%, all that's in it. Rhun, Dunland, and a little bit of Dol Amroth remain. I think everything of the Rhovanion has fallen. There's one Ravenborn Warden there. And maybe the odd slinger here and there. But everyone gave it their all here. Jeez. These guys just do not want to quit. I guess this is a very good advertisement for the Lothian Honour Guard if you want a unit that just does not fall. In all fairness, there's not really any armour piercing left to the defenders now. The Dragon's Breath are not armour piercing in melee, nor are the Haven Guard, in spite of having very high attacking stats. I mean, I would just leave the Dragon's Breath crew in there at this point. Are they going to try and shoot them at point blank with a catapult? I mean, none of the Haven Guard are actually dying at this point, that's the thing. As much as the Lothians are doing well, the Haven Guard have only lost one since this engagement started. I think a large part of this is just how tanky the Lothians are. The melee defense of these Dol Amroth swordsmen. So yeah, the Haven Guard have also proven themselves in a big way in this battle, and now we're going to see the unit collapse, I think, yeah. It got to a certain point, and now the unit count plummets. Kind of an odd end, but one that the Gondorians will probably be quite pleased with. And there we have it. Just one guy left. And there he goes. So there we have it. I don't know what this settlement is called. I guess I'll just have to make one up as well based on what I see from the map. I don't know who you would even suggest would be on home turf here among the defenders. I mean, it's on a shoreline. With this architecture, though, you wouldn't suggest it was Rhun. I mean, I'll have a think about that. Kind of unimportant anyway. Overall, the map itself was functionally quite interesting. Open spaces and choke points. I mean, kind of that classic cityscape kind of feeling. And I do think the defenders were good value for their win, ultimately. I think the initial engagements, enough of them went their way that they do deserve it. And yeah, I think it's all good. Let's see what did the damage then before the map creator Tommy, who interestingly enough was, I think, really the only one of the initial defenders for the outer engagement to probably go against them. But Tribal Berserkers doing well. You'd kind of expect that against Gondor. Tribal Levy Slingers, as we were mentioning, probably the key unit, and that is exactly what we see there. Two of them breaking 250 kills, one of them getting just below 200. That is a lot of good damage that they've done, especially given that Tribal Levy units are not the most expensive. The Javelin variant not doing quite so well, but at least paying for themselves. Rhovanion Archers as well, so we didn't really see them too much, and yet they still did okay. Rhovanion Nobles, so as much as the Gondorians did win, it's not as if the Rhovanion allowed them through free of charge, so to speak. They still inflicted a fair amount of damage. If anything, the Hoplons and the Phalanx were maybe a little bit less impressive than I was expecting them to be. But then again, the Fountain Guard and the Lothian Honour Guard do have the armour piercing, and when Gondor claimed momentum, it was with all of those high quality, high tier units, with a bit of Galathrim support as well, so that is worth bearing in mind. So big thank you to Tommy for creating this battle. Of course, he did run two variants of it. One was on the old patch, but of course this one on the new patch, and this one was apparently of higher quality anyway, so this is the better way round to do it. Big thanks to all the players as well for being a part of this battle replay. More will be following, of course, and it's primarily stuff from the new patch that we're going to be doing now. Even though much of it is still going to be preview battles, many of the things I'm starting to be sent now are run on the test build, so we're going to be seeing less and less of the old version of the game until eventually we're going to see pretty much nothing at all. So it will be the end of an era one way or another, even if release isn't within the next couple of days. It's still going to be something that's worth bearing in mind. Speaking of which, the next thing that will be uploaded to the channel won't actually be a battle replay or anything like that. It will be a channel update. So the next video will be a channel update. I kind of wanted it to be a live stream, as is the way, but unfortunately, again, it's going to pretty much sync up with a time when I'm almost certainly going to be away, and even if I'm not, there's going to be other stuff going on, which means I won't be able to really dedicate a day to doing a live stream. So unfortunately, we're going to have to go down the pre-recorded path when it comes to doing a channel update once again. But this is going to be an important one because I am going to be restructuring the channel a little bit with regards to my uploads and what I'm going to be doing, so there will be a little bit of a change going on, which I think is kind of necessary, and that feeds into the fact that we're going to be doing mostly, in terms of Reforged anyway, exclusively stuff from the new patch. I'll explain the reasons for why I'm going to be restructuring and how I'm going to be restructuring it, of course, in the update video itself, and then also just a general sort of bit of housekeeping as well, because I think ultimately this has been something that I've been wanting to do for quite a while, but I haven't been able to. Well, I've been putting it off because I was hoping to make it sync up perfectly with moving on from my current position career-wise. And I feel as though at this point, while that may very well be very imminent, I may as well just get on with doing the channel side of things now, and then we can worry about the rest of it as it follows. So yeah, that's going to be something. Fully recommend you check that out when it releases for just for information's sake, because things will be being mixed up a little bit. Not too much, it must be said. It's not as if things are going to drastically shift, but there will be a change, and I think it's important for people to know the reasons for that. So yeah, big thank you to Tommy once again. Big thanks to all the players for being a part of this battle replay. I hope you enjoyed this, and I hope you'll join me for whatever is next.